I want to offer a welcome again for those of you who have come in from Atlanta and brought the rain with you. We're going to assume that it was you, because we never have rain here. It's nice and sunny and bright most of the time. Since the theme this weekend has been the kingdom of heaven is like, I thought I'd do another parable from Matthew, but not from Matthew 13. We're going to go to Matthew 20. So if you have a Bible, and I hope you do, you can turn to Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. Perhaps a familiar parable. And the title of the sermon is the kingdom of God fair? You know, parents like to instill in their children all kinds of values like honesty and respect and kindness and generosity and fairness. But those are always, not easy to do, and even to figure out what honesty is. So, for example, you want your children to be honest, but you don't want them to tell Uncle Harry that his breath stinks. That's probably not the kind of honesty that you're after. And the same thing is true with fairness. It's kind of tricky to figure out exactly what is fair. So you might remember in school, and I'm again speaking to my own experience, it might have been different in your own day, but especially elementary school, one of the first lessons you learn is that you're supposed to play fair. But what exactly does that mean? So typically, for example, when you were choosing teams on the playground, that meant that they had to be fairly equal. You didn't want 10 kids playing against 3. That wouldn't be good. And you also tried to make sure that the good athletes were evenly divided, as well as those that were maybe not so good. Let's just say it, they were horrible, poor athletes. And you spread those out. So in that sense, fair meant equal teams. And if you had something at school, if you had, for example, a birthday party at school, you had to bring, of course, enough cupcakes for all the students. You didn't want one left out. Even if you didn't like that particular child in your class, it wasn't okay to not give them a cupcake. So that was fair. Everybody had to have things. But notice that this doesn't apply to teachers, because teachers feel perfectly fine with giving an A to one child and a D to another child, and that's supposed to be fair. So what's going on here? It seems like we have two different kind of criteria for what means fair. So on the one hand, fair means everybody gets the same. Fairness means it's equal. On the other hand, fairness can also mean that you get what you earned or what you deserve. Those are two different kinds of standards. And that's the way it works oftentimes. So think about two different siblings in the same family of different ages. 2, 3, 4 years apart. That oftentimes the older child will have maybe a later bedtime and a higher allowance and so forth. And if they have the same as the younger child, then they feel like that's not fair, and so that's the way that works. But even in work situations, the same thing can happen. What does it mean to have a fair wage? How much is your effort worth? And upon what basis should that be determined? So if we're dealing with an hourly rate, of course, the more time you work, the more money you make. Except not everyone is paid the same rate, right? And is that fair? What kinds of work deserves what kind of rate? So what about different rates for the same work? A janitor in Pittsburgh makes $12.52 an hour versus one in Cincinnati who makes $6.50. And you're like, well, how can that be? That doesn't seem fair at all. Well, in Pittsburgh, they're unionized, and so they could negotiate a better rate. But how do you rate one job over another when we're talking about that? What's fair? Is it the amount of physical effort it takes to do the job? Is it the amount of training the job requires? Or is it the amount of seniority you have? I remember a situation in a church I was working in a long time ago where this secretary who had been there for 17 years, a very valuable asset to the church community there, she was incensed when she found out the janitor who had been working there for 2 years was about to get a raise that was higher than her salary. And she came to my office and said, well, I'll clean the toilets. But it was just, how do you value those different works? And for him it was, we were trying to keep him because he was about to go to a better offer. And so, how do you say what's fair? And don't get me even started on athletes. They want athlete salaries. Do you know this guy, Cristiano Ronaldo? He's a soccer player. Never heard of him. But he makes $88 million for playing soccer. How in the world can that be fair? You know, when we think about that. Is it fair that he should be paid more money for playing a game than, say, a policeman or a fireman who rescues people's lives, saves people's lives? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. And now let's talk about extremes. So, you know, when we talk about rich and poor in the world, you think about a guy like Bill Gates who's reportedly worth $87 billion. How can it be that one guy has $87 billion when there's millions of men, women, and children who aren't even sure where their next meal is going to come from? How in the world is that fair? And so fairness is kind of a difficult kind of thing to negotiate and to figure out and to define. And these aren't questions that are new. And it's just such kind of thinking that is related in our parable this morning. And we want to ask the question, what standard of fairness do we find in the kingdom? But before we get to that, let's do a little bit of background to kind of set our text. Here we are in a gospel. And the first century was a very difficult time for Jews. It was a time of extreme hardship for the average Jew. Back in 63 BC, the Romans had taken control over Palestine, over Israel, and they appointed in 40 BC a guy named Herod the Great to be the king over the Jews. Now, Herod thought very highly of himself, and he is known as the Great Builder because he began all of these wonderful building projects. And if you go to Israel, you can see even today the remnants of some of those, like Caesarea Maritima, an artificial harbor he built. He built numerous fortresses and palaces like Masada, Herodium, Jerusalem, and Jericho. He even, for very political reasons, undertakes a rebuilding of the temple. You know, last week you might remember I mentioned how when the Jews came back from exile in Babylon, they rebuilt the temple, but it paled in comparison to what the Temple of Solomon had built. So Herod undertakes to renovate that thing, and he makes it, over a 40-year period, a work of great splendor, far surpassing the Temple of Solomon. But how do you do all that? Taxes. That horrible word that none of us like to hear. The people of the land are forced to pay up a third of their harvest in taxes. A third of their harvest goes to these kinds of projects. Now that's in addition to the 10% tithe that they were already offering, and in addition to the temple tax which they had to offer. And so even in times of bad harvest, it didn't matter. That was still due. Right? And so they would have to go oftentimes into debt, and they became tenant farmers. So there was this great economic hardship in the land for the average Jew, and that stimulated, of course, this kind of revolutionary atmosphere. And when Jesus was a young boy, there were many would-be messiahs that came along, kind of fueling the flames. And you might be interested to know that just a few miles from Jesus' hometown, there had been, when he was a very, very small boy, a revolution that had kind of cropped up for a brief moment and then was squashed by the Romans. So there was this attitude, this excitement for change, this need for change. So does it any wonder that when the crowds begin to follow Jesus, it's the people of the land, it's these poor, average folks that are most in attendance there, the lowly peasants who had suffered such great economic hardship. And so think about how many parables Jesus tells about agriculture and about farming and about tenant farmers and about absentee landowners. That's just a reflection of the situation that was in Israel in the first century. These were true-to-life stories. Parables in which he talks about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. A kingdom that would be different from that of the Roman Empire, which they knew so well. Now, the parables, of course, only give a glimpse of what the kingdom will be like. Each of them is just a snippet, a flash, a snapshot, if you will. But it was enough for them to be curious, to want to know more. And as Jesus spoke, their hearts would begin to burn within them as they heard him talking about this kingdom, because it would be a place in their minds without the Roman legions infiltrating their land. It would be a place without this oppressive taxation system. And as they listened to Jesus, they imagined a better life. Now, it's clear to us as we read the Gospels that they really had no idea what Jesus was talking about when he was talking about the kingdom. They were importing a lot of their own ideas and hopes and dreams and expectations. But the one thing they knew for sure, the kingdom would be fair. That those who were honoring God would be rewarded, and the heathen would be punished. It would be fair. Everyone would get what they deserve. And that brings us to our story, our parable in Matthew chapter 20, verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. Jesus tells this story about a guy who has a vineyard. And the vineyard needs to be harvested. He needs people to pick the grapes. And he needs workers to gather them in before they spoiled on the vine. So this landowner goes to the marketplace early one morning, driving his pickup to the town square. And just as the sun is coming up, so says Jesus, this man hires Melvin, Jose, and Jerome. Now, if your version doesn't have this, it's because you're not reading from the Greek. But they're very excited because he's going to hire them for a full day's work. And he agrees to pay them $50. And they're very excited. They believe that this was fair. Now, they're not too crazy about picking grapes. Who would be? This is going to be, kind of a long day for them out in the hot sun. But everybody has to eat. You need money for food, and they have families to feed. So Melvin, Jose, and Jerome try to make the best of it. It's hot, boring, it's tedious. But at least they have a job. Now the landowner, as he's watching them out there, he recognizes, boy, I need some more workers. So he drives his pickup back into town looking for more warm bodies. And throughout the day he does this at various hours. And he promises each of these groups, I'll be fair when the day is over. Just go in and pick my grapes. And he's so desperate to get this vineyard clearly harvested that he goes out, even it says, at 5 in the afternoon looking for more workers. And he finds George, Stan, and Harry. And they're still in the marketplace. And he's asking them, he said, why have you guys been standing around idle all day? And they say, no one hired us. So he sends them into the field with only an hour left to go. Now, there's not much time left, but in their minds it's like, well, something's better than nothing. So they go and they work. Now Melvin, Jose, and Jerome, they're chuckling to themselves, thinking, man, look at these guys. I mean, they only got an hour left to go. It's hardly worth it to go out and even break a sweat. But hey, their choice. So at 6 o'clock, the landowner pulls up in his pickup. He lowers the tailgate. He breaks out the money box, and he orders his foreman to begin paying the workers. And he says, interestingly enough, start with the last guys first. So George, Stan, and Harry are called to the front of the line. And he counts out $50 into each of their hands. And a ripple runs down the line to where Melvin, Jose, and Jerome are awaiting their pay in the back. And they hear what these guys are paid, and they get excited. And Melvin turns to his 2 companions and he says, man, this is awesome. Think of what we're going to get. And Jerome agrees. He says, man, we're living the high life now. Yet when the foreman finishes counting out their pay, they stare in disbelief at the $50 in each of their hands. And Jose starts ripping the landowner up one side and down the other, using a few choice expletives, which we will not repeat. He said, what do you mean? Giving us the same as these slackers? We sweated our tails off all day long. These wimps, they barely broke a sweat. The landowner looks at him curiously and asks, well, excuse me, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't this morning you agree to $50 when I hired you? Yeah, but, Jerome starts. But what, says the landowner? You thought it was fair this morning, so what's wrong now? If I choose to give the same pay to these guys, why do you care? Or are you simply envious? Now, interesting parable. So who's in the right? Well, what is truly fair? Is fairness when everyone gets the same, or when we get what we deserve, what we have earned? By what standard of fairness should we judge? And what in the world is Jesus trying to tell us here? But there's something about this story that just rubs us wrong. Especially if you've been seen a situation where you felt you've been treated unfairly. It is the exact same type of work in the exact same field with the same employer, and the equation seems simple to us. We would use the same standard. The more hours you work, the more pay you should get. That seems like it would be fair. In fact, I think we could appreciate there is a parable told by the rabbis that is most likely built off of this particular parable here in Matthew that Jesus tells. You see, the rabbi tells a story about a king who possessed a vineyard, and he has these workers out in the vineyard, and there's this one particular worker who is far more skillful than all the rest. So the king takes this man by the hand and he walks up and down with him and has a conversation. And at the end of the day, when it's time for everybody to get paid, he is there among the rest of the workers, and he gets paid what everybody else gets paid. And all the other workers start grumbling and says, this guy's only worked for 2 hours. And yet he's getting the same as us who worked all day. And the king says, yeah, but he did more in 2 hours than you guys have done all day. Now, I think we can understand that. If it's better quality work, then maybe it deserves more money. But that's not the case, it seems, in this particular parable. So what's the message that we're to take from the parable? In the householder's answer, I think we have one of the key lessons of the parable. At what point do the 3 early hour workers feel like things are unfair? Right? Only when they can start to compare themselves to others. Right? They had a contract with the landowner, and it was fair at the beginning of the day, and it would have been fair at the end of the day. But when they heard what the others got, that's when they thought, this isn't just right. Fair to them ends up being not what they deserve, but what they wanted, what they felt like they now needed in comparison to the others. But fair is in the eye of the beholder. Is it fair that Melvin, Jose, and Jerome got hired first, while the others had to wait around all day? Right? According to the parable, at least from the implication here, George, Stan, and Harry, it was no fault of their own that they weren't hired. And they also have mouths to feed at home. And so it seems like in the kingdom of God, one of the things that Jesus is saying is, it's not about what we've earned, and not even about what we deserve, but it's about what we need. That God is not running a business here. In fact, he's far more into relationships than contracts. And so from a business perspective, this is all wrong. But it makes sense in a relationship. So you think about a parent, a father who has his first child, a beloved son. And he loves this child. And he has dreams for this child. And he's thinking, this is going to be great. We're going to play ball again. It'll be wonderful. And he's full of love for this child. And then something unthinkable happens. His wife gets pregnant with child number 2. And he starts getting worried. He's like, oh no, how's this going to work? How can I split my love between these 2 children? I got to apportion it. I got to give, so much love. But when the second child is born, a miracle happens. He loves both of them. Right? Because it's about relationship. It's not about contracts. It's not about business. Parents don't proportion their love. And we find, I think, a similar kind of message in the story of the prodigal son. Remember, in that story, the elder son thinks that, in terms of what he's earned, he's the elder son, he's stayed faithful, he's worked all this time, and then when he sees the prodigal son come back and be welcomed in, he's thinking he doesn't deserve that, which is true. But the younger son enjoys the grace and generosity of the father. Now, when we look at this parable, people have tried to figure out, well, who are these 2 groups? Who do the early hour workers and the late hour workers represent? And there's been numerous suggestions. Some think, well, the early hour workers are the Jews and the late hour workers are the Gentiles. the Jew versus Christian, similar kind of thing. Others would say, no, these are the Pharisees versus sinners. Others, no, it's Pharisees versus the disciples. And interestingly enough, there's no real designation here of those two groups. Even in the context, it seems to represent even a broader kind of category, an attitude. You see, the early hour workers are like that elder brother who looked down on the prodigal son. They believe that these others don't deserve God's blessing. And more importantly, they feel that they themselves do deserve it. And as Christians, I think we can sometimes slip into that attitude, can we not? As if the length of time we've been a Christian matters for anything. Or the number of times I've gone to church, or the number of ministries I've been involved in, or the number of hours I've committed to those ministries, that all of that adds up and counts for something, as if I now deserve it. And as we'll see in just a minute, I would caution those who are most committed to Christian ministry and church and Christ, that is the group that is most susceptible to that kind of thinking. And those who would perhaps drive all the way from Atlanta. That serves commitment, but it doesn't earn you anything. But then there's this other curious element in this parable. The parable speaks clearly about the generosity of God, how He gives us what we need rather than what we've earned. But there's also this other message in the parable. And it's this curious element that causes all the problems, and that is, why in the world does the landowner pay these folks in reverse? Right? That part of the story messes everything up. I mean, everything would have been fine if he'd simply paid Melvin, Jose, and Jerome first. They'd gone on their way, and then he could pay the others with whatever he wanted, and there would be no problem. But there would also be no parable, right? Because they wouldn't have uttered a complaint, and that landowner couldn't have uttered his message. And so there's an element of that. It's the way the parable has to work. But there's something more going on here in that. After all, this makes no business sense. So let's recognize that. Right? So think about the next time the landowner wants to go hire some early hour workers. People in the marketplace are going to say, nah, just wait till 5. Right? Shorter day, better pay. Makes no business sense. But it's a parable. It's not a true story, right? It's a parable. And there's a point being made here. And so what I want you to recognize is that there's this curious line that the parable ends with. And if you have a Bible, look at verse 16. So the last will be first, and the first will be last. What that line tells us is that aspect of the story is not unintentional. Now here's what I want you to do, and here's why I kind of hate the way our Bibles are sometimes broken up into chapters and verses and all that kind of thing, is because we start in chapter 20, verse 1, go back to the end of chapter 19, verse 30. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. You see, that very same line both introduces and ends the parable. We call that an inclusio. It's a bracket. And the function of that is to say, I want you to read this parable with that line in mind. It helps us understand one of the messages that the author is trying to tell us. And one of the things we need to do then is to go back and look what happens before. Because this parable is told to sort out the confusion of the disciples. The confusion of the disciples in chapter 19, which has occurred as a result of two interesting events. The first event is while Jesus is traveling to Jerusalem, people start bringing children to him for him to bless. And the disciples are indignant. And they feel that Jesus is far too important for him to be interrupted and worry himself with these children. And so they're trying to get these children out of the way. They're irritated. They're unimportant and insignificant. But Jesus says, what? Don't hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. And then the very next story, don't miss this, the very next story is about a rich man. And we call him the rich young ruler. Just as the disciples are shaking their heads, this rich guy comes up to Jesus, and you can imagine the disciples kind of clearing the way. Well, watch out, here's an important guy. We want to funnel him to Jesus, give him an audience. And he wanted to know what he needed to do to have eternal life. He wanted to strike a deal in order to ensure his place in the kingdom. And he has his list of accomplishments there. Already impressive. But it says in the story that he left in sadness. For the one thing Jesus asked him to do was the very thing he could not do. To give up his position and his possessions and to come and follow. Give it all away and become like a child. And the disciples are astonished, and you have to recognize this because in their minds, when Jesus utters the line, how hard it will be for a rich man to be saved, they're like, well then who on earth could be saved? Because in their minds, the rich were rich because they were specifically blessed by God. That was a sign that God was with them. But Jesus responds, the first will be last, and the last will be first. And his point is that God's values are different than ours. The kingdom of heaven and its value system turns the system of the world on its head. And it's a kingdom of paradox. In this particular kingdom, if you want to become great, you become a servant. And he who humbles himself like a child is the greatest. And if you want to be first, you become last. So what's going on here? The children come to Jesus with empty hands. And they'll get into the kingdom of heaven before the rich man because they come with empty hands. The first come wearing their credentials on their sleeves, trying to show, here's what I've done for you, God, let me in. The last come with a broken and contrite heart. And if you think about the ministry of Jesus, throughout his ministry, who does he attract? The poor, the blind, the lame, the outcast, the people who no one else wants, because they understand his message. Those who miss out are those who feel that they themselves have arrived spiritually. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the crowd in power. And once again, I'll say it's the danger that those who are heavily involved in ministry face. And we are more and most susceptible to this. To think that our effort and our commitment to the gospel has earned us a spot. There's grace for others, but I deserve it. I deserve my salvation. And the parable is a challenge for all of us to recognize not only that God is generous, but that the kingdom is best received with empty hands. I invite the praise team to come out as we close. You know, as Christians, at least to the tradition I was raised in, and I think especially as younger people, sometimes we try and do so much to ensure our way to heaven. We don't like to be in doubt. But victory, the gospel says, comes through surrender. For some of us, we need to surrender the guilt that we feel for all the sins that we've committed, and our unworthiness, and our sense that God could never love us. But for others, we need to surrender our righteousness and our sense that perhaps we have arrived. Let's praise God.